So without too much further ado, we'll dive right into our topic. Robert Naud is our speaker this month and talking about some interesting coding practices. And so I say, Robert, take it away and then let me know how I can help you as the meeting goes along.
All right. Thank you, Matt. I'll be sharing my screen. If someone can confirm.
Oh, got it.
Yep.
All right. So make your code more readable. You'll thank yourself sooner than you think. Easy path to understand what was on your mind, I'm sure. Hopefully people will say, yeah, that can be useful, because if not, then you're just at the wrong place, I guess. I can't help you with that. So I'm Robert, father who sings choir, who likes to code with Claris FileMaker, and I'm also lazy, and I'll try to convince you that being lazy can be a good thing. So I started Accolade plus Accolade in 2019, but I've been doing FileMaker consulting since 2005, and my company's tagline is communication is everything and everything is communication. And that applies also to code. So let's see what our main objective for today is going to be. Pushing comments down our list of tools we use to make our code more readable. Basically, I'll argue that comments are one of the biggest threats to making our code more readable. It is too easy to use and to rely on, and can almost be perceived as our only tool. So I'm not completely against comments, but I believe there are some reflexes that we have that are worth rethinking and fighting off. Our agenda for today, we'll try to, like Matt said, cover all this within the hour so we can enjoy the debate afterwards. We'll be speaking about why we should care about all this. Then we'll look into naming, discuss some of the tools that are available to us, and explore if comments are to be used, how they are to be used. We'll be presenting some gadgets that can help you along the way, and then partnering notes and discussion. And if anywhere during the presentation you feel like something is calling for a discussion, just feel free to interrupt and have us chat a bit more about whatever is on screen. I can even stop sharing if we want to enjoy all of our video cast together. So, all right, just a quick disclaimer. Basically, that stuff is kind of subjective. Everyone is going to say, no, you should do it this way, and no, you should do it that way. So please keep that in mind. Some of what I'm showing is based on my own practice, and it is ever evolving, just the same way as I hope that your own practice is ever evolving. There are things that can be stemming from what was shared in the community, and there's so much stuff out there that it's difficult for me to make sure that if someone pioneered a specific technique, that I give credit. Revisiting how we write our code should be something we keep in mind. There is no set it and forget it. And I'm also going to show some concepts that are long-lasting, and will borrow from Jerry Robbins' 2014 DevCon presentation. And I also hope that you like quotes. And that said, with a quote right away, all of our relationships are based on trust for customers, employees, partners, where we eat, what we eat. It applies to code also. So how can we trust something that we do not understand? How are we going to understand our code if reading it is not making that easy? That's the main issue. Okay, so good code, sometimes people will say, oh, it has to be short, it has to be clever, it has to run fast, and so on. But bottom line is, good code is code that you can trust. Okay, if you can't trust the code that you're running, then it's not worth much. So why should we care? and why not caring can be costly. Did I mention I was going to use quotes? Here we have a quote from Martin Fowler, and says that anyone can write code that a computer can understand, but what we really should aim for is writing code that humans can understand. So in other words, a programmer's job is not to just make things work, but it's to make things make sense. Also, one man's crappy software is another man's full-time job, and that full-time job is not a fun one. No one wants that kind of job security. So this here is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, why we should care? Well, we should care for others and we should care for ourselves, because as time goes by, we are the others. Okay, so people will try to read our code, and we want code to be living, not to be set and static and dying, basically. And for that, people need to be able to read it and understand it. And for ourselves, well, even if it's only about being able to reverse engineer what are the business rules that are enforced, readability is something that is key there. Even with best memory, there's so much stuff that we put our hands into. It's impossible to remember just about everything, and it can be quite dangerous actually if we try to go based on memory. So making things readable are going to be our lifeline. So what happens if we cannot trust code, if we cannot understand code? What's going to happen in terms of maintenance and updates? Well, I'd rather not touch it. That's not really the way to keep things alive, okay? And also if we say, is it working? Is it working? I don't know, maybe. Doesn't sound like very reassuring. Actually, I don't think there's any tone you could use answering, I don't know, maybe, to this question that is going to make that reassuring. So basically, we want to know how things are working, because that's how we know that we can trust them. Okay. And lastly, there's also the let's start over an IKEA effect. So basically saying, if we don't trust something, we're going to be tempted to simply put it to the trash and then start over. And with that, we're going to have to test things and debug and everything that comes with it. Okay. So even if the code to start with was running just fine, if it was running perfectly, okay, that can still happen. It's not about is it working well or not. It's about, can you trust it? Do you understand what's in there? Okay, and notice the nuance between perfectly and good code. Okay, because good code is code that can be trusted. I cannot stress that enough. Okay, another way for code to lose trust is when you have comments that are inconsistent with what the code does. So comments can be a lot of maintenance. And did I mention that I'm lazy? So the IKEA effect that I mentioned here is not a play on words. It's an actual thing. If you look it up on Wikipedia, there's some people that said, hey, you know what? If you are taking part into building something, you are going to be placing more value. You're going to give that creation more value because you took part to it, as opposed to something else that you were not involved with. Okay, so that's one of the effects that is going to give you some bias there. There are also other effects that come into play. One is called the mere exposure effect. Okay, so that's one where people tend to develop a preference for things merely because they are familiar with them, and that's completely understandable. I mean, very natural. If you get to choose in between something you don't know and something you know, well, chances are you're gonna go with the things that you know. And there's also the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that's one that's a bit different, where people with a low ability at a task overestimate their own ability. So it basically saying, if you're not an expert familiar with the topic, you think stuff is easier than it really is. And that's something that clearly applied to me when I figured I could put together the material for this presentation.
In the FileMaker world, that's Brian Dunning and Freddy Krueger, I believe.
So where do we spend our time? Robert C. Martin makes a statement that's pretty heavy here, saying that we spend well over 10:1 a ratio of time when we compare the time we spend reading to the time we spend coding. So for every 1 hour you code, you're going to be spending 10 hours reading code. For every 10 hours you code, you're going to be spending 100 hours reading code. 100 hours, that's a chunk of time. So we ought to be trying to make that easier on ourselves, okay? And that's also something that ties back into being lazy on my end. I want that stuff to be easy. And on the other side of the slide, we also say there's a fact that's a bit crazy when we think of it. I mean, when we learn to speak, and when we learn a language, well, we're going to be learning how to read before we learn how to write it, you know. But when we're talking about programming language, oftentimes that's not the way it is, you know. It's just like, okay, here's how you can go to basic syntax and off you go. Just go and code, you know. Who cares about making it readable? It's just follow the syntax. Pretty crazy if you ask me. And a funny quote here saying, well, if you think you don't need to make your code readable because no one else ever looks at it, make sure you're not confusing cause and effect. Food for thought. So about naming here, just keep with me here for a second. Do not worry, I'm not going to be forcing a naming convention on you. This is not what this is about, even if having a naming convention for yourself is a good thing. So naming is something we should obsess about, and we'll see why obsessing is a good thing. So Phil Carlton says, those are the two things in computer science. I know nothing about cache invalidation. I'm sure it's a nightmare. But for naming thing, I have to completely agree. It is deceptively simple, but when we look into it, it's actually hard. So naming maybe your most powerful tool. It's what you can use to be understood. Naming, if we're into something that lets us choose the name of our creation, it means we're a designer. Okay, so naming shows that it shows our intent. It lets us tell a story. So naming things, let's be good parents. Okay, FileMaker lets us rename stuff easily. Layouts, fields, scripts, you name it, everything gets tied back by internal IDs. But I would say let's not rely too heavily on that feature. One, if we say, okay, we're gonna change that name later on down the road, you know, for now, just let's name it, I don't know, something. Okay, well, later on is going to be much later than you envisioned, if ever, and it's just a plain bad habit. You know, would you rename your child once he gets 5-year-old? Would you say, hey, Sam, congrats, you just turned 5. You know what, Sam was just something we threw out there because we needed the name, but now we're going to call you Fred because Fred is much better. No one would do that. And actually, when we think about renaming can break things. Okay, so I said layout, scripts, and fields. Well, not so fast. If you have a server schedule that is running a script, if you rename your script, that's going to break. Same thing for FMP URLs. If you have an API call, well, may be into trouble if you rename your script or a layout or a field that call is relying on. So we name stuff all the time. So there's a lot of things in FileMaker that we get to name, custom functions, tables, fields, table occurrences. The list goes on and on. I mean, arguments, script parameters, and so on. So there's plenty for us to practice and get good at it. Okay, if we just pay attention, we will improve. So let's just watch how we name our stuff, and go from there. So what is a name, or more importantly, what a name is not? I will say that a name is not an abbreviation. Okay, I understand that sometimes the drop downs may be too narrow and so on, but let's avoid abbreviations. They require way too much context for them to be understood. If you think you have enough, you give enough context for the abbreviation to be clear, no, there's not enough context. There never will be enough context, basically. Just skip the abbreviation and give the full name, okay? If you ask 5 people for how to abbreviate this, you're going to get 5 different answers. So trying to do this on the reverse just gets even worse. It's also not a shorthand or an acronym, okay? I mean, like with everything, there can be exceptions to this, but I stumbled on a system once where the developer thought of a good way to be saving keystrokes would be to make a custom function called GSP, and that custom function was simply doing a get script parameter. And basically, every time I would go through the code for everything that was in there, I had to think, oh, how would he shorten this regular function into something that is just an acronym, and that would just drive me nuts. So if you want to save keystrokes, go look for a text expander. We'll discuss some options there, but do not name things to be saving keystrokes. That's not the point. And a name is also not part of an arbitrary series. Okay, so if you've got stuff that is script 1, 2, 3, variable 1, 2, 3, XYZ new, XYZ old, XYZ new 2, copy 2, we've seen some of those, right? So let's just make sure that we name things the right way, and there are plenty of ways to get naming wrong. Okay, so we really want to pay attention to that, and those things are easy to skip over. Okay, so let's not have an abbreviation, not have a shorthand, and not have a series. Also, your name should be pronounceable, and it should be easy to search for when using your preferred DDR tool. So let's look at some examples. Bad stuff. Okay, so mostly variables, $PC, $prodcat, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, $D with comment that says elapsed time in days, GSP that I mentioned earlier, and then if pattern count, so on and so on. What may be good ways to name those things? So product category, much better than just $PC. Who would have guessed that? No one. You would need to have a ton of context to know that $PC is product category. And now that I've mentioned that $PC is product category, I'm sure that you know what prodcat may expand to. It's obviously going to be product catalog, you know, because there's only this one thing that it can abbreviate. And that thing I didn't want to name, everyone would have guessed that it's filtered student names, right? So no, because it's not spelled out. Okay, we have to spell things out. It's not taking 5 more seconds to just spell it out, okay? And $D, well, what should we replace it with? How about elapsed time in days? Let's take that whole comment and name the variable this way, okay? Someone may be saying, yeah, but I'm using a comment. That's more readable, right? Well, tell me, are you going to add the comment everywhere you use $D? Because if not, you're making me hunt for the information. And if so, well, then why not simply name the variable that way, okay? And not carry the comment everywhere. So, and the last example, I'm going to skip over the getScript parameter, but the last example is not really about naming, because what we have on the left is all native FileMaker things. You don't get to choose that name. But if you package this into a custom function and then you choose the name of your custom function, you have something that you can make like 10-fold times more readable than having to parse out, hey, wait, there's a calculation here. What is it trying to do? Okay. So some recommendations. If we have booleans, let's try to have something that is going to start with is or has, like is paid. If we're talking about arrays or lists, let's use plural. If we have functions and scripts, we should aim for something that's going to have a verb and ideally also a target. And for just about everything, well, consistency, consistency, consistency. Okay, don't switch between styles within a single system. So there's countless type of words that have very similar meaning. And if you go from fetch to retrieve, get, set, read, write, update, create, new, add, prefix and suffix, and you swap them around, uppercase and lowercase, that end up having no meaning, just keep things consistent, okay? That is priceless. And be specific, be explicit. No one wants to guess what you were thinking, not even yourself. If you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it again? This is a great quote. It can apply to countless things, and it applies to naming too. So bad names are like raindrops. A single one is not going to ruin your day, but you never receive a single raindrop. The first one you see tells you there's more to come. And here I'll be sharing something personal about variables. I liked JSON so much when it was introduced in FileMaker 16 that I started naming my variables the same as the JSON path of my script parameter. So something like invoice, bill to, zip code. You may or may not be liking this. You may or may not be a fan of something like that. But one thing that I wanted to share is do not extend that to fields, because the data API uses field names as keys in the resulting JSON, and having keys with periods in them will give you nightmares. It will give you trouble. So you don't want to go there. Basically, FileMaker is giving you a warning for a good number of characters not to use in any field names, but the period is not one of them. And I would argue that maybe it should be one of them. All right, so more tools. If all you have is a hammer, everything will look like a nail. And by hammer, I mean comments. So we're not going to go into specific patterns like error handling and stuff like that, but we're going to look at some tools that we have aside from naming. So good code is like a good joke. It needs no explanation. That's also something good to aim for. And to achieve that, one of the first things we can do is avoid magic numbers, okay? So what's a magic number? Well, it's a number that is put there, basically hard-coded with not much context, that's gonna have you try and guess what it's all about. So if you have a loop and it says exit loop if I is greater than 52, then do stuff, and then you set the variable and you increment your I. What is 52 about? There's no way to know. Okay, so it could be that you are dealing with weeks, in which case, well, don't use 52. Put 52 in a variable called week count, and your code will be that more readable. You'll know, oh, we're looping on weeks. Okay, and then everything is going to be more readable. And if we're not talking about weeks, if we're talking about cards, well, let's say, okay, it's 52 is the deck size, and then you go from another example where, okay, it's clear that we're going to be dealing with cards, pun intended. So not everything is a magic number. I mean, 0 and 1, they're okay. If we're talking about stuff that is just widely accepted, how many hours there are in a day, how many minutes per hours, how many seconds per minute, that stuff you don't have to write a variable name that's going to contain that. But I came across an example of this that really made it clear for me. It was about two functions using the number 151, and one was called "Have I caught them all?" and the other one was called "How many more do I have to catch?" And then the reveal was that 151 was swapped with a variable name called total Pokemon, and then the two functions became much more clearer to me than just saying, oh, 151, what is this all about? So figure out what your 151 is, and then get rid of it, swap it in with something that is going to be more readable. Go easy on using the negative. Okay. So I don't know if you ever felt like hide when should be show when, but that happens to me all the time. I write my little calculation there, and then I test it out, and how come it's not working? And then I put parentheses around, I throw a not in front of it, and then I'm good. So that's because your brain has to switch mindset, and when you're thinking about that stuff. So make sure that you use it only if it feels really natural, only if it flows, because if not, then it's a killer. It's really something that is going to give you trouble all the time, and is going to make your code harder to read. So people understand a positive statement much better, much more easily than a negative one. Okay, it needs to be intuitive. And also, let's use indentation. Okay, so if we have a basic case statement trying to say what should the full name be if the first one is empty or the second one is empty, and if we have both, and so on and so on. It's not a crazy complex calculation, but just having it be displayed with indentation is going to give a much better understanding of how things are paired, and in this case, the comment is simply there to preserve the pattern. The comment is not really to detail or to explain something. It's really more to the eye. You want to have things in paired and not have this one extra result floating. So now do use indentation, but do not use it too much. When you're nested 5 level deep, it's not easy to read anymore. And I'm sure you've seen this happen somewhere. Using white space into calculations. Okay, so again, here I have on the left a case statement where everything is just one next to the right, and then I have the same case statement on the right where I throw in an extra carriage return in between the pairs. And here, of course, again, the calculation is oversimplified, so it's not really that problematic to read when it's on the left. But if we have text that starts wrapping around, well, it becomes problematic. So just making sure that things are there, set the right way, so that when things change, when the field that you've placed there gets renamed to something longer, that everything else is already going to be set to be optimized in terms of how readable it is. Using whitespace in script. So whitespace in script was introduced long ago enough. There is no reason for you not to use it. Okay, it helps divide your scripts into subsections and makes it so that it's inviting to name whatever section that you have in between the breaks with all the white space. Using custom functions. So I did use an example earlier with is running on server. Basically, custom is it says it all. It's lets you choose a name. So for every reason, purpose, intent, you can use the name that you want. And as a bonus, you get something that is dry. If you need to make an update, well, everywhere your function is being used, the update is going to be carried over. So, and also I would say you're going to be grabbing custom functions left and right from sites like the brand on site and so on. But do not hesitate to rename someone else's custom function. I mean, there's not going to be a custom function police to say, hey, so and so wrote the function and he intended the function's name to be this and that. No, there's no such thing. Okay, so just be careful when you do, because some functions are used quite a bit in the community, and maybe you'll end up having some code that you'll copy paste, and if you don't have the exact same function name as the original, well, that code's going to break. But all in all, I would say you're not forced to use the original name, and it's worth thinking about using a name of your own. Using let statements. So here we have an example where we're talking about line items and then the cost and then a discount. The calculation itself is not, again, super complex. Okay, we can have a let statement that's going to let us explode very clearly what's the full cost, what the discounted rate, and then the extended cost, and we know that we're outputting the extended cost. So just from the let, I know what I'm outputting. Chances are it's going to be also the name. I'm sorry, also the name of my my variable or my field name, but still spelling it out is never overdone. Okay, and sometimes the calc itself may be clear enough. The let statement may feel like overkill, but like for instance, in this case, there could be changing business rules. If we have to give the largest discount out of a product discount, a customer discount, and a coupon and a general sale, then trying to update the calc that we have up above is going to turn into something just unreadable. Okay, whereas if you already have your let statement there, then you're good to go. So, and again, 100 over here and the 2 number that we see here, or the 1 that's up above, those are not magic numbers. Okay. Avoid null values in your calls. Okay, so this applies to calls that are position-based, and maybe you use script parameters that are position-based, but something else that is position-based in FileMaker is function calls, and even more so, the plugin calls. So if I have a plugin that says send mail, and here's the call, okay, and I go, can you add a BCC, please? Well, wait a second, I kind of have to guess where the BCC would fit in there, so if we have something where everything is spelled out, adding a BCC, even if the variable is blank or empty or not even initialized, Here you declare it and you're good to go. You don't even have to change the call itself. So that's more readable. If we take a script parameter here, okay. Hey, James, what's that script second parameter again? Well, go figure. I have to go look into the script to figure it out. There's no way for me to just guess that, okay? So again, if you use a variable name, it's going to tell you what it is, regardless of the content. It may be blank, but you're going to know that the second one that it's expecting is the primary phone, if it is a primary phone or not. So I myself would not recommend sending script parameters just separated by carriage returns, but for the purpose of the illustration here, that's a good example. Also avoid performing find with the restore option. Okay, I'd say in terms of readability, it's just not readable. You have to click to figure out what the query is about. So it's basically it's obfuscating. Okay, no one wants to have to go through extra dialogues to be able to read your script. So let's just make sure that we spell it out. And by spell it out, we use the steps that a regular user would use. You know, we set fields, we create new records, omit or whatever we need, and we can build the query, and it's going to be readable. I don't care. Some people will say, well, it's obvious from the context that's around. No, it's not, or it's so simple, or it's against the primary key, or no, just spell it out. Okay. So, and also about the scripts, knowing what the parameters our script is expecting is something that is really to be looked into. So initialize your variables early. Let's look at the header part of the script. If all of your variables are not there, well, someone is going to be calling the script, and next thing you know, an expected parameter is going to be missing. Okay, so let's raise everything from the beginning. We shouldn't be seeing like get script parameter at row 56 in your script. Okay. So some people will use even that, will take that even a step further. They will say, well, the parameters that are expected should be in the name of the script itself, and you can do that. But if you do so, just know that script names are limited to 100 characters. So here's another funny quote, one that I'm sure you've heard before. Says, always code as if the guy who ends up making your code will be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. So something that not everyone knows, though, is the original quote said something like this. The exact same thing, but code for readability. And also to know is that it's not something that came up with 2 years ago, 5 years ago. No, it dates back to 1991. Okay, so it says being able to read each other's code is really a concern that's been around for quite some time. It's harder to read code than to write it. This ties directly into our other quote about any fool can write code that a computer can understand, and good programmers can write code that humans can understand. So it's saying the same thing, but in a different way. Okay, and Joel Spolsky knows a few things or two about coding. I believe he's the one of the founders of Trello, and also a co-founder for Stack Overflow, and he has a great blog on coding in general. So couple rules and recap. Okay, so explain your magic tricks. Secrets are not welcome. There are no bonus points for speaking, for being sneaky or clever or fitting all your code in a single line. Saving keystrokes will not save you time. It will cost more time. Good naming is more than half the battle. Let's avoid magic numbers. Let's use white space and indentation without nesting too much. Custom functions and let statements are our friends. Let's avoid values in our calls. Never make the reader guess. And let's spell it out. Find request with find request and variables and initialization. So by the end of all this, you should have your own writing style. Your own doesn't mean that it's unique. It means that it's yours. If a reader looks at your code, at some point, what comes next in your code will be predictable because of the trends and patterns it follows. The way things are will become what the reader expects. That is when you can say mission accomplished. So comments. So if we are to use them, let's make sure that we use them the right way. Code never lies. Comments sometimes do. Code can only do what we tell it to do. Comments are not for the computer, they're for us. They drive nothing about the code. Every time you write a comment, if it is about what the code does, if the code is updated, your comment is at risk of being outdated. Again, if the code is updated, your comment is at risk of being outdated. Comments that tell you what the code does are heavy maintenance. So what do we have in FileMaker in terms of comments? Well, we have field comments, we have script comments, multi-line may be an option or not, depending on the platform that you're on. End of line comments like this, or block comments like that. And you also have notes that you can put on the relationship graph. So good comments will tell you why, not how. And they let us know the general intent. What is it we're trying to accomplish? They skip over the obvious. And for variables, well, we can use the comments to let the developer know what should go inside. Okay, so what's the range of valid entries? What's the unit of measure? Or even for a unit of measure, one could argue it maybe should be part of the name itself. So basically, you have different types of comments. Some comments will be informative. Some comments will be warnings. Okay, so for someone else who debugs your code, something like, hey, this perform script on server will run for 5 minutes or just about, and that's normal. You know, that's good feedback. I want to know when I run something like that, what is to be expected. And there's no way that just the code is going to tell me that. Another thing that comments can be is they can be to-dos, you know, so that's something that is temporary by nature, unless you believe that nothing is as permanent as the temporary. But hopefully, if you write yourself or someone else a to-do in a code comment, that will get taken care of, and you'll be able to remove that comment in the end. So bottom line, code can't explain why the program is being written and the rationale for choosing this or that method. Code cannot discuss the reason certain alternatives approach were taken. So those are good things that we can speak about in comments. Incorrect documentation is often worse than no documentation. And that's not only because being misled is a complete waste of time, but more importantly, because it erodes the trust relationship we have with the code. And again, everything is about trust. If we can't trust the code is going to go to the trash, and we're going to rewrite something else, and we're going to have to test and debug and so on. And we're going to be familiar with that up until someone else is not familiar with it. And then this circle keeps going. So let's look at some gadgets. Everyone loves gadgets, Batman, and if it's good for him, it must be good for me as well. Things to put in your backpack. So MBS stands for Monkey Bread Software, okay? And it's a FileMaker plugin and it is available for a fee, but the features that that you can use to make your code more readable are available for free in the plugin, and but that's if you are using a Mac computer, and it can check for variables declaration and warn about unknown variables in your script. That's been a lifesaver for myself countless times. Just no one is shielded against typos in a variable name, so that's a good thing. Custom syntax colorization, if and if loop and loop block highlighting. So when you select one, it highlights the second, or if you select the end if, it's going to highlight the opening matching if statement. Find and replace in a calc, highlight patterns in script steps. So you can search for a specific text pattern in a script steps. You can have a search box in the relationship graph. Custom fonts, even for your counts, if you feel like the font that is used natively in FileMaker is not readable enough, and your I's look like L's and your zeros look like O's, and so on. A text expanding utility. Okay, so you have many options, a few of them here: A-text, text expander, typinator. A-text, I think, is like $5, so there's no reason not to use one. And just keep in mind, if you work on both Mac and PC, then look for something that is cross-platform, because chances are you're not going to want to rewrite your expansion snippets for one to the next, and so on. And a snippet holder. I myself am using Clip Manager, but there are other options out there. Something that you can copy, paste elements into this holding place, and whenever you need them, let them be custom functions, script steps, layout objects, or anything. You just keep them there, and they're close by for you to reach to. And one more item is MonoDraw. Okay, that's also Mac only. Think of it as ASCII art, but for workflows. Okay, so it's a bit like Visio, and uses regular characters just to draw the shapes. Okay, and you need to use a monospaced font to have it displayed nicely. But it's something that, for instance, if you want to have a workflow in your relationship graph, well, you can draw a note and then put that text in there, because it's just text, and it's gonna give you something very visual as an output. So, parting notes: there's only two kind of programming languages: those people always bitch about, and those nobody uses. Basically, if we think the problem is coming from FileMaker, well, let's think again. Okay, our code is not going to be more readable because we write in another language. So it's not about platform. If your code is not readable in FileMaker, it's not going to be readable anywhere. So this is not about selecting a platform. And lastly, a nice parody. Someone wrote quite extensively about how to write unmaintainable code, and it's a great read. It's fun to look at, and it's also a great guide about what not to do, and you can just flip things around, and get inspiration on what to actually do to get maintainable code. So that is the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for the time you've spent with me today. And if you want to widen the discussion, we can share about all of this. Now you can go and write code that others will trust.
A good message. I'm super curious, like, what other people sort of disagreed with, because a couple things that you said, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do it that way, but I want to know kind of what other people are thinking on that subject.
I think I'll share. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Sure. And I will echo what other people are saying. Thank you very much. Some people might be bowing out right now to be watching the debate. And if you want to be one of those, thanks very much for sticking with us. And we'll see you next month. And for those who want to stay and talk for a little bit, I'd love to kind of recap some of the points and especially talk about the things that maybe we don't agree with.
Guide. I don't know. Input is like where?
Hi, Michael, you're talking about something?
Can't really hear Michael if he's trying to talk.
Yeah, I think he might have been having another conversation like in his house.
Oh.
That's okay.
I'll kick it off with, I agree with most things. One thing that I would think about is naming convention for single $ vars versus double $. And I'll blame it on eyesight. I like a lowercase first character for a single $ variable, because if I have a variable name like script name, if I've got like a $ and then a capital S, and I squint my eyes a little bit or blur them, it looks like double $. And then more recently, I've been tending to just go all cap with the double $, just to get a visual pop. So lowercase for single, uppercase for double. But I did like the tildes for the let variables. That's that should almost be enforced by the coding engine, I think. FileMaker should build that into the product.
I actually use all caps for let statements instead of the tilde.
So
Speaking of using all caps.
And I've taken to doing an underscore before the name of my variable, because when I squint my eyes, even the single $ looks like a capital S. And in terms of readability, since I do tend to use English words in my variables, it's more literally readable if there's an underscore separating either the $1 or the $2 signs, especially the $1 sign, from the English word that I'm actually using to name the variable.
I think my favorite one was I was having a variable that I was tracking hit counts on things, and I had a variable called $hit.
But
There's been several examples of that variation.
yeah, very cute.
I've actually taken to, you brought up also, Robert, like your love of JSON, and I do as well. And JSON variables are case sensitive. So if you were used to case insensitive variable names in FileMaker, but JSON's not like that. And so now I have actually switched to making all of my variable names all lowercase and using underscores in between it. So I don't know, everything's always evolving. And it's funny is David brought up something a minute ago, he probably doesn't use the same thing. So here we are, two people in the same company working on the same product using different standards, which is good and bad. It's nice because we can look at something and I can see that he wrote it and now I can trust it because he's really good.
Yeah, I use the lower camel case, basically. First letter, lowercase, and all the other ones capitalized.
But just being consistent with, you and I don't tend to work on the same scripts, we work on like different things. And if each thing is consistent with itself, top to bottom, that trust factor is such a good message. And not about speed, even though that may be a second importance, but one of our other developers loves to talk about writing for your future self.
And who knows, maybe sometime down the road, you know, we'll have something that lets us parse out our code and spot patterns and say, well, here is the coding standards that we want to see enforced, and it's gonna apply the proper, quote unquote, proper casing or the expected casing. So you could have different teammates, like as they are coding, that they would write it in their own way, but then in the end, if the standard is everything all caps for global variables or lower camel case and so on, then this could be enforced. I think when we'll get there, there's a lot of people who will be very, very happy.
I think I can riff off that. One of the conceptual things we have here is the concept that when you're working in FileMaker, you're working in different zones. Like sometimes you're in the field definition zone and you do something, and then you exit commit, and then you're in say the script step zone. So one of the things we do is for field names, for example, we will embed metadata about the field name, whether it's stored or unstored, or potentially stored, whether it's a calculation and whether it's a text. And we can then build utilities that can validate the correctness of that name. So if you're looking at a field and you're going to use it in a relationship, you need to know whether it's going to be stored to be on the right-hand side. Or if it's on the layout, can you open it up to browse mode? So embedding the, thematic version is embedding metadata into the name of the object has been helpful to us.
Yeah, I mean, this is all about naming conventions, and everyone may have different ones. I tend to do something like that, but not necessarily up to the field type. But some people will go that far, and credit to them. In terms, it is also maintenance. I mean, if you change your field type, you have to update the name accordingly, and so on and so on. I know that I can't recall exactly when FileMaker introduced the little glyph icons that let us know a bit more about what type of fields we're dealing with. I would hope that they would be present in more of the different interfaces that FileMaker gives us. But all in all, whatever extra metadata you attach to the name of your field, if the field name itself is not carrying the meaning of what the field is about, if you're using a horrible abbreviation, then everything becomes pointless. So that's really more what I want to stress. I'm not really about should this be uppercase, should this be lowercase, and so on. It's more about overall we need to have something that is more readable, and that's what matters.
Yeah. So, one of the things we had somebody that I used to work with who would do this thing where he would automatically parse out the parameters at the beginning of a code of a script, and you didn't have, it wasn't verbose and explicit enough to know what was being passed in just by looking at the script. So you actually had to go where the script was called from to see what parameters had been sent in. And it was, and we used to have this argument back and forth. I'd say, just actually say set variable, get this parameter so that you can see what is expected. And you know what's been created.
A function to set them. I remember that. It used a function to set them invisibly. So you could
exactly
have one line of code that just instantiates 30 variables or something.
Yeah, and it was a let statement. It was a single let statement. You couldn't tell what had been created. And I would say, write it out. I want to see what the variables coming in are supposed to be. I don't want to have to go looking to see that. And so self-documenting code is, I think, what that points to. Doing things like calling a Boolean is something, because then it's like a sentence when you're writing it. If is finished, then do this thing. And so I always like that. I like to think of it as a sentence, and I'll write variables and parameters as something that would fit into a sentence, so that when I'm reading it, I know what it's doing.
Yeah, let's try to be as close as we can to just plain English. That's nothing is going to be more understandable than that. And about the script parameters passing in and being obfuscated, what gets raised and not raised. I did switch in my own code to using a function that raises everything, but I was so relying on having the information in the header part of the script that now what I do is above that call, I create set variables with the variable of what the script is expecting, even if they're set to nothing,
Right.
just so that I know what's going on.
Right.
So
Yeah, and
there's a bit of maintenance there because it's not relying on what is actually there to control what is being raised lower, but still it's like having, to me it's like having the best of both worlds, because it's a lot of coding when you have to parse it out separately.
I agree. I actually particularly liked your tip about if you've got something like you know, if $n is greater than 52, and you're like, what's 52 represent? And you may know it while you're writing it, but actually setting a variable that says number of weeks equals 52, now you use number of weeks. That's a great suggestion, because it's like that Boolean is, you know, if is something, it becomes a sentence when you read it. Which I like.
Yeah, and it gives you context.
Yeah, it gives you context. I think that's a great suggestion.
I've got one place where I'm intentionally, maybe not intelligently, but intentionally inconsistent. I try and name variables in normal English, like meeting ID instead of ID meeting, because you would say meeting ID. And then I can remember that and use it later. But when I'm defining field names, I find that I follow that same construct, except groupings of fields like flags, timestamps, particularly in those two cases. I always call it flag and then something in normal English, and timestamps is something in English, because I think it's mostly because how I use those fields later. They're not used the same as variable fields per se. They're documentation fields. So I don't know if anybody else struggles with that, or if there's thoughts on that.
We had a debate over here that was quite lengthy about whether it should be is underscore or just is. My coding partner wanted is underscore and convinced me if the second part of that phrase is something began with the letter I, the underscore would be preferable. So I like, you know, is and has, as per what Dave said earlier about when you use it later in code, it does read like a sentence. So is underscore is what we're using. Or has.
And
depending.
Dean, to go along what you said, I have the same issue with dates. I mean, turns out most of the flags that I used to have now, their prefix is, you know, so that kind of morphed into something else. But for dates, if we have an invoice printed date and an invoice whatever due date and so on, I don't know why, but I have a very strong preference to have all the dates listed together. So they're going to be date printed, date due, date this and that. And I guess it depends on how I'm going to be having other attributes to them. So if they're just standing still like that, and most likely I'm going to have just that. But if I need to log other information about what happens on that date, like who closed the invoice or who printed the invoice, then chances are it's going to be printed date, printed by, printed, and so on. So I might flip it around, but it's never easy to say from day one what it's going to be. But I'll try to think, okay, am I going to be just having this one element, or am I going to be having more?
Yeah, that one's a bit of a coin toss. Let me pick on one thing that you mentioned a lot, parameter. I've by habit and practice for a long time have named a variable $PARAM, and that just goes way back. More recently, I've thought if when I'm using get parameter, I don't think there's a huge performance difference between declaring a variable, setting a variable to get script parameter and using that versus using get script parameter over and over and over in the script. It might be a little transparent, but you'd lose some readability. So I guess I'll just stick with what I'm doing for now, because I don't think it's hurting.
Yeah, it might be, I don't know. It just seems much easier to me to just define param. I think there's a few rules that we can break because they're common. Another one kind of along those same lines, Tony, is I always use found count on something because I want to know like what my count is and check it many times in the script. And it's always $FC, which is an abbreviation. I know that's like what you say not to do. But I mean, we can learn a few things. Like we can adapt to something new and know that if you see FC, it only ever means one thing, and it's found count, and it's only ever defined exactly when you see it. You always see it in context. It's not.
Mhm.
I would argue that that one is actually fine. Even
Yeah,
though I
but
wouldn't.
and it may be fine. And again, the basic is just say, okay, is it harming the readability or not? You know, if you find that reading that is just readable because it's everywhere and it's consistent, then you're good to go.
Mhm.
Also, I would say if you do use a text expander with a string like $FC, I would say I'm ready to bet there's like not much other things that will start with $FC, and you'd be okay to just have it be replaced and auto expanded to something that is the full like $found count with whatever casing you want to have, and it would do it for you. You know, you would
I know,
have
but then I
nothing to
have
change.
Yeah, the longer your variable names are, the other side of that whole thing of having things be really long is you're going to make typos, and then your code's going to break. And so it's going to, you know, there's an end, right? You can't have variable names like $first Monday in March after Lent, but before Easter, because that's a stupid variable name. You know,
Well,
you
to
have
me,
to have some. There has to be like reasonable length.
yeah,
Of,
well,
a couple words.
for me, MBS takes care of that because it's going to highlight a variable name that is not declared. So like I said, it saved my life a good number of times, and I'm really at risk whenever I'm on Windows. I have to really watch the name of the variables that I'm typing because there's frequent things that I take for granted running MBS on my Mac.
Yeah, that really helps.
Yeah, I don't actually use that one. That seems like a pretty good feature, but I'm generally anti-plugin and generally anti-custom function.
Anti-custom function. Well, I want to hear more about that.
They were so great in FileMaker 7, but dude, we're at 19.1 now. They haven't changed that feature one iota.
So it's still just as great as it was in 7.
Just as shitty as it was too. You can't, especially recursive ones, write them as a script. There's no reason to write a recursive custom function if you can write it as a script, which you can then debug. That's kind of a different whole subject, but.
I would, we're using custom functions, I'd say less and less, still using them for their terseness and the, the ability to just, when you just need one little tiny thing and the dryness. But I've certainly dialed them back a little bit. And I would agree with what Matt just said. I really like script functions because they're dry across files. And I'm not I don't really like recursive custom functions. They're hard to run. They're hard to read. And, they run out of scope.
Really hard to
They run
debug.
out of the 50,000 is a bit of a cap.
Yep.
I find that sorry, I was just going to say, I find that there's a time and a place for custom functions. I think, something that you're doing all the time, you don't want to have to call that same script because all you're doing is converting a FileMaker date into like, a JavaScript style date.
Totally.
You just make a custom function for that, and then you just call a custom function, pass the data in, and it happens no matter where.
Yeah.
And there's sometimes where you can't, if you're, for example, doing something in a script and you're making a calculation, you can't call a script from inside the calculation engine. So you have to use a custom function in some cases. Although you can also just do it in a let statement in those cases as well. But it depends on what you're doing. So I think there's use for them.
Yeah, now we have while. I mean, I don't know if while is any easier to debug than a recursive custom function, but
I've had opportunities to use the while function, and it's pretty good actually. It's once you get used to the syntax of it, it's like a let statement. But
it's like when a let statement and a loop statement got together.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, go for that FileMaker humor whenever we can, right?
I actually have to jump out of here in a minute.
Yeah, we should end in a minute here.
Recommendations.
That the debate's already a bloodbath.
Any
No,
recommendations?
long variables, short variables.
Keys and primary keys and foreign keys. I started off and have just never gotten away from 1 underscore for primary key and 2 underscores for.
Oh God, that's a
foreign key.
field name?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
It was 2005, the FileMaker standards document that was produced explicitly stated that, you know, so that's what we use because I was working back in 2005 in FileMaker.
Mhm.
And then at what point do you change your standards, your code generation tools and all that kind of stuff? So I put the question out over and over every time it comes up. If I'm going to do SQL, which is, I think, the primary reason that people give not to use an underscore. And if I'm going to escape my field names, which I'm probably going to do anyhow to protect against brittle code, am I taking a performance hit? And I've not gotten an answer to that. Therefore, I have not renamed my primary keys.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But
On-
if someone
on my-
told me like, oh my God, there's a massive performance hit from escaping it, then I'm not a huge fan of SQL calls anyhow.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah, I use getters and setters off a faceless logic file because I think they're probably cleaner and faster, easier to debug.
Robert?
For the IDs and names, I used to be using mostly just like table name and ID, you know, and I like that, like regardless of if it was a primary or a foreign key, and I like that because it would let me use import with field matching names like just about anywhere. But now more and more, I'm starting to be into for the primary key, have it be named only ID, so that when it's
that was two thumbs up out of Portland.
So so that when you read, say, table occurrence : ID, you know that it's the primary key.
Yep.
And for everything else, then a foreign key will have still the table and ID.
I usually do it ID and then the table, and then I put them all together at the top because I think sorting alphabetically is dumb, but that's just me.
No, I like that ID. Keep your keys together, whether you underscore or no underscore. Keep your keys together.
Yeah.
So say that again, Matt. You use a capital ID and then lowercase table name generally.
Yeah.
Or?
So like if I have a contact table, it'll be ID and then ID underscore company, ID underscore phone, ID underscore whatever I'm going to do. You know, ID
so that's
underscore address shipping.
Yeah. So that's going to segregate it from whatever lookups you have. So if you have like an invoice with customer ID and customer name, so those two are not going to be together because one is going to be ID customer and then
the other one's ID. But then I know which one's the primary key. If I see ID to ID or ID customer, which one's the primary key? If I see ID and ID customer, I know which direction is going.
Yes.
So there's context. I don't have any opinions about any of this stuff. You can't tell at all.
Yeah, no, I was just
you
suggesting
guys just agreed on that.
You could use customer ID and not ID customer. You know, that's all.
That's true. That would work fine. I just yeah.
Because I like it when it's with the rest of the customer information if I have lookups.
I admit I break Robert's rule when it comes to this because I use an abbreviation, but I do the keep KP and KF and then the table name. And you might think sorting alphabetically is stupid, but sometimes it's the easiest way to find the field you're looking for and along.
Oh yeah, no question. But
right?
then I switch it back.
Yeah, but and because I put the K before the P and the F, they sort together because otherwise the P would be off with the P's and all the foreign keys would be together in the F's.
That's good. That's towards that same thing.
So Matt, you're using custom sort then when you're looking at your fields?
Whenever I can, that's what I do because I always try to have the keys at the top and then the meaningful stored fields after that, and then calculations and other useless shit at the bottom. And there's less and less of that as time goes by, as I get more experience as a developer. I make calculated fields only when kicking and screaming demands from clients require them, or in very rare cases where there need to be. Now we have layout calculation with a button bar. What do you need a calculated field anymore for most things.
About name full.
That's one very good reason, because for searching, you need that. You need an indexed
And then,
stored field.
okay. Yeah. So it's name full underscore CT is what we do. Actually, S_CT stored.
I use ZC XXX __ name. I'm just kidding. I've seen those though.
David's code.
Well, I'm
No, not
glad
mine.
because I mean, when I chose that topic, it felt to me like people would be like, well, this is stuff that we all know about, and so on and so on. But I realized that it's great to start discussions, you know, because everyone has their very own opinion about this and that, and how they do this and what. So it's really nice. I enjoy this.
Yeah, thanks for coming. It's been really very useful and fun.
Mhm.
And even it's a dry topic, but it's definitely a valuable one to revisit.